Welcome back everybody, it is that time again. Welcome to a comprehensive history of the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG. We are now in the year 2012. Our story begins on January 20th with the release of Order of Chaos. This is a continuation of last year's push into the OmegaExceed meta. And while this set wasn't too crazy with the amount of cards it introduced, the cards it did introduce were pretty damn impactful to the game. Photon Flasher was a level 4 beat stick that you could just drop onto your field for free if you didn't have any monsters. Insector Centipede and Insector Hornet pretty much completely insect the deck. Centipede was the searcher for the deck, while Hornet allowed you to pop your opponent's cards. Wind Up Shark was an extender you could drop onto your field that would allow you to go into rank 3, 4 or 5 plays with Wind Ups. Wind Up Rat became a key part of the deck's combo, as its soft once per turn effect allowed you to continuously add additional Wind Up monsters to your field. And Wind Up Carrier Semi-Mighty was the piece that brought the entire package together, allowing you to special summon any Wind Up monster from your hand or deck. On top of that, if any of your Wind Ups went to the graveyard, it could detach material to recycle them to your hand. The release of Centipede, Hornet, Semi-Mighty, Rat and Shark would push Insectors and Wind Ups to the top of the metagame. Then we had some of the generic support. MX Saber and Foka is a rank 3 Earth Warrior Exceed monster with 1600 attack and 500 defense, and it requires 2 level 3 monsters. Once per turn, you can detach 1 Exceed material from this card, special summon 1 level 4 Earth Warrior or Beast Warrior type monster from your deck in face up defense position, destroy it during the end phase. On release, Foka was considered an excellent but not too strong card. It would only take a few years, however, for the ever-increasing Warrior card pool to push this card over the limit. As it often goes in Yu-Gi-Oh!, summoning from the deck is one of the most powerful effects a card can have. Number 96, Dark Mist, was a rank 2 monster whose effect allowed it to attack over essentially anything plus 100. And Blade Armor Ninja was a beat stick that could straight up poke Trice. Coming shortly after would be the release of the Dragons Collide Structure deck. Unlike all structured decks, it would bring just a handful of new cards to the game. The cards it did bring, however, were big. Dark Flare Dragon and Light Pulsar Dragon were new high-level chaos monsters that would allow you to swarm the field and go aggro on your opponent, with the additional benefit of recovery if they were destroyed. And then there's Eclipse Wyvern. If this card is sent to the graveyard, banish 1 level 7 or higher light or dark dragon type monster from your deck. If this card in the graveyard is banished, you can add the monster banished by this effect to your hand. The intended use was pretty clear. Send it to the graveyard, pitch Red MD from your deck, banish for a Dark Flare or Light Pulsar, and then add the Red MD to your hand and summon it. However, like most things, cards that can pitch directly from deck to graveyard have a very high power ceiling, and this one does more than just that. You'll be seeing this card a lot. So let's look at some early tournament results for 2012. YCS Leipzig would be run by Steven Sullis with his Dino Rabbit deck. Not much has changed from previous lists, but we do have a new little tech card in Jirak Greiber. This level 4 fire dinosaur monster has a 1700 stat line, meaning it can beat over stuff, but more importantly it has an effect that pushes the deck's strategy. If this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle, you can special summon 1 Jirak monster with 1700 or less attack from your deck. It cannot declare an attack this turn. It's pretty much a Flamvel Fire Dog for dinosaurs. Greiber attacks, you get the other Greiber, then you overlay into Dolka or Lagia. Now would also be a good time to make a quick amendment about the Dino Rabbit deck. So you may remember that in 2011 I mentioned how the Master Rule had changed, and that inherent effect activation was no longer possible on Summon. Well, that was only true in the OCG. The TCG did not change to Master Rule 2 immediately. In fact, we continued to play with Master Rule 1 until around May. What did this mean for Dino Rabbit? Well, with Ignition priority still in effect, Rescue Rabbit could dodge the likes of Effect Failure and Fiendish Chain, meaning you had fewer options to prevent your opponent from bringing out the Exceed materials. For a brief period of time, Rescue Rabbit wasn't just good, it was completely broken. If anything, it's surprising that this deck didn't win more YCS events while this ruling was in place. Coming second that day would be the first Insector list we're going to see today. Fabian Renner's list pretty much sets the standard for what we can expect of this deck going forward. Triple Centipede, Triple Dragonfly, Triple Hornet, and a lot of strong power cards. This is a early, incomplete version of the deck. It was a playable top tier deck at this point, but there was still more to come. Also taking place in February is YCS Atlanta, run by Marquise Henderson and his Tech Genus deck. This is a spicy build. So we got the two Beast King Barbaros with the skill drain set. Driver special summons from hand, and all your floating effects will solve in the graveyard. As such, it's pretty easy to set up in this deck and get your plays going. The card that brought it all together, however, was Horn of the Phantom Beast. This trap card has the effect where you can target one Beast or Beast Warrior type monster you control, against 800 attack. When the equipped monster destroys an opponent's monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard, draw one card. With this being the Dino Rabbit meta, 2400 was the attack stat line you needed to be able to play over. The 800 gain from Horn made this more than possible. Finally, we have a 6 Samurai list from YCS Guadalajara, played by Oscar Safala. There hadn't been any significant changes to the 6 Samurai lists recently. This deck was making use of cards that hadn't seen that wide a play up to this point, and they paid off. Take for example, Ascension of the 6 Samurai. Select one face-up 6 Samurai monster you control. Special summon one 6 Samurai monster from your deck with a different name but equal attack to the selected monster. During the end phase of this turn, destroy the selected monster. With there being several 6 Samurai cards that could share attack values due to their effects, it wasn't too difficult to get your field set up for your Synchro and Exceed plays. Triple Shen's Dojo meant this deck was definitely innovating on previous Sam strategies. And that's the early meta for 2012, a pretty diverse and healthy meta when you look at it. 3 tournaments, several different top decks. It seems like the game's in a pretty good spot. I can't imagine the upcoming March ban list needing to change much, if anything at all. Oh. So yeah, the March 2012 Forbidden Limited list is a bit of an infamous one. So let's go through it, shall we? Unlimited, Call of the Haunted. Semi-limited, Lumina the Lightsworn Summoner, Marshmallow, Reborn Tengu, Emergency Teleport to 2, Level Limit Area B, Shien Smoke Signal, Torrential Tribute, Ultimate Offering. Limited, TG Striker, The Agent of Mystery, Earth. Now these are pretty big hits for their respective decks. But then you get to Forbidden, Glow Up Bulb, Spore, Trishula, Dragon of the Ice Barrier, Trap Dust Shoot. Now, in all fairness, Trap Dust Shoot had to go. But yeah, this ban list caused a lot of contention. Some people crit, and a lot of people accused Konami of hitting the popular decks, so people would be forced to play Dino Rabbit in Sector. So to strike down all the older decks like this, it was actually quite painful for a lot of people. And I guess Konami must have known something, because for the first and only time ever, they released an article explaining their reasoning for the ban list. Now, a lot of people talk about this article. We're going to read it. We're going to read the entire thing. So this article is titled, Thoughts on the March 1st 2012 Forbidden Limited list. Almost 3 months ago, on March 1st, the Forbidden Limited cards list was updated again. Now that things have settled down a bit, we wanted to share some of our thought processes behind the Forbidden Limited list creation. Why have a list? First, we're often asked, why have a Forbidden Limited list at all? To answer that, let's go back in time to 2003, a time before there were any Forbidden cards. Back in those days, when you built a deck, you would start by including Raigeki, Dark Hole, Monster Reborn, Harpy's Feather Duster, Heavy Storm, Change of Heart, Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity, Sinister Serpent, the Labyrinth Duo, Confiscation, The Forceful Sentry, Painful Choice, Imperial Order, Tribe Infecting Virus, Sangan, Witch of the Black Forest, Mirror Force, Ring of Destruction, and probably Mirage of Nightmare and 3 copies of Mystical Space Typhoon. That's 23 cards already, over half your deck, and you haven't even added any of your main monsters, and you haven't even started your theme or strategy, but you're already running out of room. You could choose not to use those cards, of course, but when all your opponents are using them, you need to put them in your deck too, or else you'll get clobbered. You have hundreds or even thousands of cards in your collection, but you feel like you're forced to use the same 20 cards, plus whatever monster theme you add in. And since all your opponents are going through the exact same situation, they're all playing for the same cards you are, so you keep seeing the same cards every time you duel, and you keep using the same cards every time you duel. Same decks, same cards, every duel? Sound boring? You're not the only one who thinks so. And you know what? This first section isn't actually incorrect. You can debate how many copies of Mystical Space Typhoon was optimal, but otherwise it's like, yeah, every deck was running those cards. So far this is pretty solid. It's like, some could argue that yes, metas develop over time, but in 2003, the meta was these cards, and even if you were to try and reboot a 2003 format today, these cards aren't coming out of the decks. Why we have a list? To avoid situations like that from happening again, here are some of the many reasons why we have a Forbidden Unlimited list. To prevent a situation where you feel locked in, where you have to play with certain cards or a certain deck. To keep it so that there are choices for what deck you play, avoid having one dominant deck. To restrict solitaire play decks. These are usually first turn combo decks where one duelist plays by themselves for 15 minutes, shuffling and summoning cards while their opponent triddles his thumbs. To eliminate cards that are confusing, cause games to stall out, create infinite loops, or can otherwise interfere with tournaments and make them unpleasant. So far, I have no arguments against this article, really. It's pretty spot on with the reasoning for why ban lists exist in card games. Even the point about restricting solitaire decks, I can get. I think solitaire decks are funny personally. I think Empty Jar was a funny deck. I think some of the FTK decks in GOAT format are funny. But I can see why you don't want people to play them. If you lose the dice roll against a solitaire deck and you get FTK'd, it's not even your fault. When you take away the player's agency to have a hand in whether or not they win or lose, it just becomes a bad game. So let's move on to the reasonings they gave to card changes on this list. For a start, let's look at why they banned Trap Dust Shoot. This was a devastating card if you had it in your opening hand and went first, but later on in the duel, drawing it from your deck could be a dead draw, since it became less likely your opponent would have 4 cards in hand. A limited card since 2007, this card had seen an increase in use lately, which meant more players were playing with a card that they would either draw mid-duel and be pretty unhappy when they did, or else they would have it first turn and make their opponents miserable. This was lopsided, either too good on turn 1 or not useful at all later on. That's a negative play experience either way, so it had to go. In fact, I'd say the second point doesn't even need to come into it. The fact that it did what it did going first just makes the game more luck-based. Just get rid of it if that's all it does. If you open it, you're probably winning, so why keep it in the game? Spore and Glow Up Bulb. Let's break this down. Tuners are okay. Tuners that can be used for any Synchro monster are okay. Cards you can easily search for or summon from the deck are okay. Reusable cards are okay. Reusable cards with no cost are even okay. Synchro monsters with powerful effects are okay. Synchro monsters that can be summoned using any Synchro materials are okay. Turns out, tuners that can be used for any Synchro monster are easily fetched from deck, are reusable with no cost, and can grab powerful Synchro monsters that have no specific requirements. This turned out to be not okay. Since they were introduced, Synchro monsters have been a big factor in duels, and will keep making more of them. But these level 1 plant tuners and their supporting cards, Spore, Glow Up Bulb, Dandelion, Lonefire Blossom and 1-for-1, were causing a large number of decks to be played exactly the same. It was reaching a point where deck construction started with these 5 cards, then you added more cards on top of that base. Sound familiar? It's similar to what we described at the start of the article. And that's the point where we have to step in and take action. We looked at several solutions we could try, and also decided to go with the heart of the problem, which we felt were the reusable tuners that were easily searchable and could be used to synchro summon anything. Had Spore and Glow Up Bulb missed even one of the factors mentioned above, they probably would have been okay. Plague Spreader Zombie, for example, is a reusable tuner that can be used for anything. It's also easy to search out the deck, although 1-for-1 is admittedly a lot more splashable than most cards you can use to fetch Plague Spreader Zombie. The key difference is that Plague Spreader Zombie costs you a card from your hand, so he isn't free to revive. Plague Spreader Zombie is currently making the line between what is considered okay and what isn't, and Spore/Glow Up Bulb rounds up on the other side of that line. We talked about combinations of other cards we could hit instead, but we felt that hitting 1-for-1 would unreasonably punish all level 1 monsters. Hitting Lonefire Blossom would hit full-blown, legit, plant-themed decks, and hitting Dandelion would eliminate a versatile card that goes in lots of fun decks, but would actually be ineffective at stopping the core problem. Additionally, Whenever we pondered, why are we even looking at restricting these other cards, the answer is always, we're looking at cards so we can find an excuse not to go after the real problem. So ultimately, going after Spore and Bulb was the way to go. Here's the thing about this reasoning. If it was like October 2011, you could make this argument, maybe. If it was September or August, you can make this argument. By the end of February, Plant was not the best deck anymore. It was a deck a lot of people played, but it was not the top deck. These tuners were super strong. They gave the decks their combo plays, it gave the decks their comeback factors. It did not give them the power to be the best deck. Spore and Glow Up Bulb are powerful cards. They also feel very powerful. But if we just look at the meta assaults themselves, they weren't game warping or too powerful. They allowed a very strong deck to exist. Out of all the changes on the list, I believe this might have been the one that was the most contentious at the time. Interestingly, the blog did not go over the reasoning for banning Trishula. I guess that one was a lot more agreeable. It was the most powerful Synchro monster after all. Lumina, Light Swan Summoner, now semi-limited. Light Swan monsters have an interesting history with regard to the Forbidden Limited list. When they first came out, they got a lot of attention, but didn't win a lot of tournaments and didn't have much of a bandwagon effect, meaning that Light Swan continued to occupy a solid chunk of tournament slots for a long time, but they just weren't winning, and the number of Light Swan decks wasn't going up. There were some cries for players to do something about Light Swan at the time, particularly because of the powerful nature of Judgment Dragon. But this is a good example of how we won't go after a card just because it's powerful. It needs to actually threaten the tournament scene to get hit, and Light Swan weren't doing that. Running into a powerful Light Swan deck at a tournament could certainly ruin your day, but they weren't just topping another fence, or growing in size, to mark them as a concern. It wasn't until players started combining Light Swarm and Dark monsters into Twilight Chaos builds almost 2 years later that Light Swarm finally started to build momentum. Now that they've cooled off some, looking at easing things up a bit, so Lumina goes back up to semi-limited. Similar to Lumina, 6 Samurai had huge momentum coming out of the gate and needed to cool off a bit. Our options were to delimit this or delimit Legendary 6 Samurai Shi-En. Went with Smoke Signal because a double Shi-En on the first turn, which is very possible, can be truly miserable for the opponent to play against. Yeah, it's a nice buff to 6 Samurais, but it's funny that they did this immediately after 6 Samurai topped an offense anyway. It's like, whatever, this is a inconsequential change. Torrential Tribute, now semi-limited. Raise your hand if you remember when you could have 3 of this in your deck. We're reviving Torrential Tribute as a potential counter to solve some of the mass summoning and repeat summoning effects players find so attractive these days. So you hit Plant, the deck which gets hit hardest by Torrential Tribute, but then you semi-limit Torrential Tribute to hit the mass summoning decks anyway. TG Striker and the Agent of Mystery Earth, now both limited. These 2 decks were building up momentum in Asia and threatening the tournament diversity there, so they needed to get reined in a little bit. As an interesting note, after the list was already decided, Marcus Henson revised CS Atlanta with a TG deck. A sign of what might have come? We may never know. This leads credence to the idea of nipping this in the bud was the right call. That TG deck was anti-meta as it came. It had nothing to do with the agents being played in it. It was all because of Skill Drain and the Horn of the Phantom Beast. It was a super strong deck designed to counterplay Dino Rabbit and Insectors. Yes, TG Agents is a very powerful deck, but at least give it some time first to see if it really does develop the same way in the TCG. Level Limit Area B. More and more players are using Exceed monsters, which are immune to this card's effects. It's always nice to keep the Forbidden Limited list as short as possible, so there's less to keep track of. Therefore, we move this to semi-limited. I mean, if that's your reasoning, and I agree with it, just unlimit the card. But Konami TCG have always been weird like that. They don't like to move cards from 1 to 3. They just want to move cards from 1 to 2, 2 to 3. Call the Haunted, now off the list. Once considered a staple card, we moved Call to semi-limited previously, and very few players took advantage of the chance to play 2. Maybe it'll get some attention at 3, but it's also possible that Duelists have decided the sun has set on this card. March 2012 has always been considered one of the worst ban lists in the game's history, and it's just so easy to argue against the reasonings they were giving. There was plenty of data even back then to go against their decisions. They didn't have to hit the decks they did. But alas, Konami does what Konami does, and as players, we move on. But yeah, overall, this is definitely a very transparent form of communication by Konami, one that we've not seen before or since 2012. It's definitely an interesting footnote in Yu-Gi-Oh! History, something so significant to not just the time it was made, but even to today, that I felt like it had to be given a large portion in this video. Now that we've been able to address the March 2012 Forbidden Limited List controversy, let's move on, shall we? Releasing on March 16th was the Premium Collection tin. This set actually had some really good stuff in it. Jump forward, if you control no monsters, you can special summon this card from your hand. This card was playable back then, but it would be around 2017 and onwards where it would really start to see a lot of heavy play. Machina Cannon, a monster that would allow you to discard machines from your hand to summon it. It was a nice little option to put in Machina decks. As a level 8, it could single-handedly pay for the cost of Machina Fortress. Blaze Felix, the Burning Bombardment Bird. Once per turn, during your main phase, you can inflict 300 damage to your opponent for each card on the field. This card cannot attack during the turn you activate this effect. I smell a very unhealthy toxic burn strategy in this card. Kagamucha Knight. When you normal summon a level 3 monster, you can special summon this card from your hand. This card cannot be used as a Synchro material monster. This card is good and widely played for many of the same reasons that Junk Forward was good and widely played. It was used in Exceed decks, just not the Exceed decks from this era. Give it 5 years. Masked Hero Acid, ooh, here we go. Must be special summoned with Mask Change, and cannot be special summoned by other ways. When this card is special summoned, destroy all spell and trap cards your opponent controls, and if you do, all monsters they control lose 300 attack. This card is a rage crit card. Very, very good card. Still played in hero decks today. Void Ogre Dragon. 1 Dark Tuner, plus 1 or more non-tuner monsters. Once per turn, during either player's turn, when your opponent activates a spell/trap card where you have no cards in your hand, you can negate the activation and destroy it. This screams Infernity, but actually it was more used in Dark Synchro decks, because it was very easy to empty your hand after you'd completed your combos. With 3000 attack and 3000 defense, this was a very intimidating card even without the negate. Also releasing around this time was the April 2012 edition of Shonen Jump magazine, containing the Exceed monster, Acid Golem of Destruction, 2 level 3 monsters, 3000 attack, 3000 defense. During your standby phase, detach 1 Exceed material from this card or take 2000 damage. You cannot special summon any monsters. While this card has no Exceed materials, it cannot attack. A 3000 point beat stick for 2 level 3s is such a good trade that this card went into play immediately. It didn't matter that you couldn't special summon, this card allowed you to get out of almost any situation through sheer force. Releasing in April would be the Exceed Symphony structure deck. This deck would mainly consist of reprints, but it'd have some nice new Exceed monsters to go with it, them being the Djinns, Musa Rhythm, Temtempo, Mellow Melody, and Maystroke. The rank 3 Djinns all had effects that allowed them to boost each other. Musa Rhythm allowed you to double the attack of one of them. Temtempo allowed you to increase the attack of all of them. Mellow Melody allowed one of them to attack twice. And finally, Maystroke just kinda did its own thing. Once per turn, this rank 4 monster allowed you to detach 1 Exceed material from it to target 1 face-up attack position monster your opponent controlled and change it to face-down defense position. If a face-up Djinn Exceed monster you control would be destroyed, you can detach 1 Exceed material from that card instead. Maystroke immediately became a staple. Being able to Book of Moon an opponent's monster was a very good effect, and being able to detach to prevent destruction essentially turned this card into a rank 4 Sem mains. In April, we'd see Peter Gross win YCS Toulouse with Twilight Dragons. This deck would utilize the Dragon Structure deck at full power and pretty much do everything Konami intended players to do with it. Eclipse Wyvern would be sent to the grave to send Red MD and then be banished for one of your Chaos monsters, allowing you to add the Red MD back to your hand. The Light Sworn engine made it very easy to mill cards to your graveyard for Chaos plays. and the Thunder King Ryo allowed you to counter every other deck in the format. Such was the power of the card at the time. With May came the release of Galactic Overlord. This set added a powerful new archetype to the game and gave a lot of strong cards to Exceeds. The Hieretic was a very large archetype of dragon monsters, but for the most part it was only a select few people were using. Seal of Conviction made it very easy to search the cards from the deck, and Seal of Supremacy meant that you didn't have any trouble getting the high levels out. But the main purpose of the deck was to use the level 5s and 6s as part of your engine for your Chaos Dragon decks. Hieratic Dragon of Aset and Hieratic Dragon of Nefet made it much easier to go into rank 5 Exceed plays, while Hieratic Dragon of Tefnuit was a level 6 Cyber Dragon-like that gave you better rank 6 access. The fact that these monsters were all lights just meant they had very good synergy with the Chaos deck. Insectors would get another piece of their puzzle with Insector Ladybug. The Light Rays would be a mini archetype that would see use in all sorts of decks, not just in the light attribute based Hieretics, but also Light Swans, some Chaos variants, and Fairies. Nightbeam was a very good spell card that allowed you to target one set spell or trap your opponent controls and destroy it. Your opponent would not be able to chain that targeted card in response. This made it a very good answer to the popular chainable cards that opponents could use whenever they were targeted by destruction. Card D was a very cool addition to the game at the time. This level 2 machine monster had the effect where it cannot be special summoned. During your main phase, if this card was normal summoned this turn, you contribute this card to draw 2 cards. Then it becomes the end phase of this turn. You cannot special summon during the turn you activate this effect. So at the cost of giving up half your turn, including your battle phase, you can draw 2. It's a bit of a slow card, but back then it was a 3+1, and if the card says draw 2, you play 3. Finally, we have the Exceeds, and these were some very powerful Exceeds that got used in all sorts of decks as combo pieces, negates, bosses, aggro, and screw over cards. Photon Papillotative had the effect where it could target a defense position monster on the field and turn it to attack position, and then deduct 600 attack from it. This was used in roundups to change Roundup Rat into attack position, so it would get its effect to summon a roundup monster from deck. Very cool combo. Gaia Dragon the Thunder Charger had a very unique summoning condition. You could either use 2 level 7 monsters, or you could layer over a rank 5 or 6 monster to make it immediately. In the case of the Dragon decks, you could pull it over one of your rank 5s to get a 2600 beat stick. That beat stick could then attack into one of your opponent's defense position monsters and do piercing battle damage. What was cool about Gaia Dragon is that Fiendish Chain was a very popular card in 2012. So say one of your Exceeds gets hit by Fiendish Chain, you can lay Gaia Dragon over the Fiendish Chained monster to play around Fiendish Chain and continue to push. Photon Strike Bowser was a rank 6 warrior with 2700 attack. Once per turn, during either player's turn, when a monster effect is activated on your opponent's side of the field, you can detach 1 Exceed material from this card, negate the effect, and if you do, inflict 1000 damage to your opponent. So a one-sided negate, that's pretty nice. To go back to the Dragon decks again, they could make Photon Strike Bowser, try and negate their opponent's effect, and if it gets stopped by a card such as Fiendish Chain, you can just Gaia Dragon it. Finally, number 11, Big Eye, a rank 7 Dark Spellcaster with 2600 attack and 2000 defense. It requires 2 level 7 monsters. Once per turn, you can detach 1 Exceed material from this card to target 1 monster your opponent controls, take control of that monster. This card cannot attack the turn you activate this effect. This effect is amazing. It is a monster with a built-in Change of Heart effect that is permanent. In this meta, Blackluster Soldier was legal. You could just straight up steal your opponent's Blackluster Soldier and it was yours permanently. Who wouldn't want that in their deck? And the card's price at the time reflected that. This was a very expensive and sought after card. The pack releases in May wouldn't slow down. May 24th would see the release of a very unique and cool set, Battle Pack Epic Dawn. This set would be designed for something that Yu-Gi-Oh had never messed with before, sealed play and draft play. Sealed and Draft has been common to games like Magic the Gathering for years, but Yu-Gi-Oh! Had never dared dip their toes into that realm until now. As a sealed playset, Battle Pack Epic Dawn did not take the ban list into account, meaning it could reprint a lot of powerful cards, including banned cards like Harpy's Feather Duster, Raigeki, Pot of Greed, and Graceful Charity. More importantly for modern players, it was the debut of Gem Knight Pearl, a rank 4 non-effect Exceed monster with 2600 attack, making it the strongest rank 4 monster at the time. Finally, there was the big reprint of Tour Guide of the Underworld, a card that was selling for well over $100 before that point. It was a much needed reprint, as almost every deck was running it. Releasing on the exact same day was Hidden Arsenal 6 OmegaExceed. This set saw support for existing archetypes such as Gusko and Gishki, but it also introduced Phylons. The cards of note in this set would be Gust Kraken for the Gishkis, as well as some of the Exceed monsters. Evergishki Merogeist had the effect where any monster destroyed by it would be shuffled into the deck instead of going to the graveyard, meaning it could stop cards like Dandelion and Sangam from resolving. Digusto Felix had the effect of targeting one wind monster on the field and allowing it to attack twice in a battle phase, meaning that many players were using it to poke their opponent for 3000 in game. And finally, the Sigma was a rank 4 monster that required 3 monsters to make. It had the effect where it could attach one Exceed material to target one Fate of Attack Precision effect monster your opponent controls, and equip that target to the card. At the start of the damage step, if it battled a monster with the same attribute as the equipped card, it would destroy that card automatically. The Sigma was a pretty good card, but Merogeist and Felix were the stars of the show here. Gustkraken does need an honourable mention for its hand looping effect. There was an entire deck built around its ability to take cards out the opponent's hand, and that deck was so obnoxious to play against that the Gishki decks are still paying the price for it today. The cards don't stop coming. April 2012 would see Konami unlock the shock as they released number 16, Shockmaster. This rank 4 monster required 3 materials and had the effect where once per turn, you can detach one Exceed material from this card to declare a card type, that being monster, spell or trap. That type of card, if spell or trap, cannot be activated, or, if monster, cannot activate its effects, until the end of your opponent's turn. Anyone who played at the time remembers exactly why it was so feared. Once your opponent knew what deck you were playing, they could just summon Shockmaster and declare whichever card type would hit you the most. If you were an Insector player, they could just declare monsters and it was GG. You couldn't activate Centipede, Ladybug, Hornet or Dragonfly. Going against Dino Rabbit, you could declare monster and just stop Rescue Rabbit from being resolved. If you were going against a deck that used a lot of back row, then you just declared traps and you were completely safe on them. It was a super powerful card, and it's no surprise that it got abused as much as it did. Also releasing at this time were the less essential but still cool manga promos Kachikochi Dragon and Elemental Hero Escuado. It's August, which means it's World Championship time once again, and this year the World Championship returned to Tokyo, as it took place in Roppongi on the 11th and 12th of August. First place would be taken by home countryman, Saito Akikazu. Akikazu was repping Insectors this tournament, a deck which took 6 of the top 8 spots. All of top 4 played Insector, and the index were close to identical. That's right, this is Insector's Sweep, baby! Dark World also saw strong meta representation in this tournament, but Insectors was just too strong. Winning the tournament pretty much came down to winning the mirror match and ousting anti-meta decks. Akikazu made the wise decision to main deck Chain Disappearance, as hitting one of the Insectors got rid of all copies in the deck. In the mirror match, that would give you an overwhelming advantage over the opponent, especially if you banish their copies of Hornet. One of the coolest side deck options featured was really Eternal Rest. This card, when activated, would destroy all monsters equipped with another card. Since the Insector monsters would equip themselves to each other, resolving this card was a +1, as it got rid of both the equipped monster and the equippee. Also top 8ing this World Championship is what I consider to be the coolest Exodia deck ever made. This deck no doubt surprised opponents, because who comes to a World Championship playing Exodia? So let's break this deck down bit by bit. You have your 5 copies of Exodia. These are your bricks. You don't want to draw them until you've set up your combos. Zangan obviously fetches Exodia from the deck. Swift Scarecrow will end a battle phase if your opponent tries to attack you directly. All these are self-explanatory. Pot of Duality allows you to dig for your deck. Upstart Goblin is a free draw. Reckless Greed, Jar of Greed, and Legacy of Yatagarasu give the deck more draw power. Threatening Roar and Raboku are there simply for the sake of stalling out turns. Now let's look at the cards that really made this deck work. One Day of Peace allows both players to draw 1 card, but neither player then takes damage until the end of the opponent's turn. So not only is it thinning your deck, but it's buying you a turn, meaning an extra draw phase. Accumulated Fortune, for those who don't know, is a Reckless Greed that you can activate on Chain Link 4 to draw 2 cards. Unlike Reckless Greed, however, you do not lose your draw phase for using it. Now we look at the main combo of the deck. Hope for Escape is a trap card that has the effect where you can pay 1000 life points to activate it, draw 1 card for each 2000 points of difference between you and your opponent. If you have 2000 life points and your opponent has 8000 life points, you draw 3 cards. This card is your main win condition for getting your Exodia pieces and other protective and drawing cards. But it does need a bit of assistance. Upstart Goblin increases your opponent's life points, as does the Trap gift card, which straight up gives your opponent 3000 extra life points. The way this deck is designed, it is possible to give your opponent an extra 9000 life points. Those 9000 life points turn Hope for Escape into a +4. If you get your life points low enough, you could end up drawing 5, 6, 7, maybe even 8 cards off it. In a sense, this deck is essentially Chainburn but Exodia. Maybe not a fun deck to play against, but a really enjoyable deck to pilot. The only reason this deck got this far is because of the nature of the World Championships. Many consider the World Championships to be a glorified local, a local consisting of the best players in the world. If you took such a deck to a YCS, you probably wouldn't get as far. It's just too much deck variance and too many rounds. But in a shorter tournament like a World Championship, you could make a run for the top 8 with such a deck. Joel Winston might not have won the World Championship, but he won our hearts, and has gone down in Yu-Gi-Oh! History for playing it. With the World Championship over, it was once again time for some new card releases. Releasing that same week was the second wave of 2012 Collector's Tins. For the first time since the 5Ds era, these tins were actually previewing cards that hadn't come out yet. Heroic Champion Excalibur would be a promo in this tin, despite its own pack not releasing for another couple of weeks. This light rank 4 warrior monster allows you to attach 2 materials from it to boost its attack by double until your opponent's next end phase. If you needed to get over a high attack benchmark, like an Acid Golem, you could just play Excalibur. Excalibur would then be the cover card of Return of the Duelist. This set was a very noteworthy expansion to the game, and would introduce many archetypes that would be mainstays through the Exceed era. Spellbook Magician of Prophecy and Spellbook of Secrets would help ensure that that deck remained an engine for years to come. Magician could search Secrets, and then Secrets could search any in-archetype spell card in the entire deck. With finding your combo pieces quickly being such a big part of Yu-Gi-Oh! At the time, this was a very, very strong opening. Also debuting in this set was Madolche, an archetype built around the gimmick of shuffling monsters back into the deck instead of sending them to the graveyard. With this deck's self-recycling nature, it was pretty much immune to deck out, and you were hardly ever going to run out of resources when playing it. As such, it was a strong deck in grind game heavy formats. Gear was a deck of low-level Earth Machine monsters who would turbo each other out onto the field so you could overlay into Exceeds. As essential to the deck as these early Gears were, they didn't see much competitive play immediately. Instead, the archetype would be completely overshadowed by its own boss monster, Gear Gigan X. This Earth Rank 4 machine monster allowed you to detach 1 material from it to add any level 4 or lower machine monster from your deck to your hand. Unsurprisingly, it became an instant staple in every machine deck in the game, and would remain that way for years to come. Return the Duelist was not a set defined by individually strong cards, but it brought a lot of new decks to the game. Any cards that were individually strong would have entire decks built around them instead. We'll see more on that later. With it being post-World Season, it was now time for the September 2012 Forbidden Unlimited list, and boy were there some movers and shakers on this list. Necro Gardener, Marshmallow, Destiny Draw, Emergency Teleport, Level Limit, Swords of a Feeling Light and Magic Cylinder were all unlimited. None of these cards were really presenting problems at the time, though Emergency Teleport, still a strong card, just nothing to really take advantage of it. As semi-limited sections go, this was a pretty impactful one. Blackwing Kalute went to 2 because the deck just wasn't a contender anymore. The Breeze went to 2 because of all the hits to the plant decks. Rescue Rabbit went to 2 because it was just seeing so much play. Agent of Mystery Earth moved down to 2 because it probably should have never been at 1 to begin with. Tour Guide of the Underworld deservedly went to 2 because every deck was running it. Hero Lips went to 2 because Hero Beat was pretty strong at the time. Same goes for Emergency Call. Erratic Seal went to 2 because it was just way too easy to search stuff. Pot of Duality went to 2, as did Reasoning, and Mirror Force, not as strong as it once was now at 2. For cards going to 1, Chaos Sorcerer would once again be limited because of how heavily it was being played in Chaos Dragon decks. Insectors would get a slapdown as Dragonfly and Hornet both went to 1. Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon would also go to limit. Spore would be unbanned. Tsukiyomi had finally been released years after it would have been fine to release it. Evergishki Gustkraken went to 1, putting an end to those hand loop decks. Wind Up Carrier Sem Mighty went to 1 because it was just way too good a searcher. And Ultimate Offering went to 1 because gadgets suddenly were really good thanks to Gear Gigan X. In Forbidden was Brionek, Dragon of the Ice Barrier, and Future Fusion. Both of these cards in their pre-errata form were huge problems. Future Fusion pre-errata I can confidently say is one of the strongest cards ever made. So overall, this is a much better ban list than March 2012, Nature is Healing. Post-ban list, the changes would have an immediate effect on the metagame. YCS Toronto would be run by Josh Graham and his Wind-Up decks. With Insectors now hit, the way had been made clear for Wind-Ups to go and take the top spot. The combination of Magician, Rat, Sen Mighty allowed you to turbo monsters onto the field and establish strong boards. These boards were capable of being equally strong both defensively and offensively. It was also the deck that Photon Papillotative shined in, as turning Wind-Up Rat into attack position allowed you to summon more Wind-Up monsters from your deck. Though he didn't win Toronto, our hearts were once again run by Jeff Jones, as he came second with his Grand Soil Psychics deck. The 5Ds era set Extreme Victory introduced a number of new psychics to the game, but at the time they just didn't have anything to play into. That all changed with the release of Grand Soil the Elemental Lord. This card cannot be normal summoned or set, must be special summoned from your hand by having exactly 5 Earth monsters in your graveyard, and cannot be special summoned by other ways. When this card is special summoned, you can target one monster in either player's graveyard, special summon that monster to your side of the field. If this card leaves the field, skip the battle phase of your next turn. So here's the spice that Jeff Jones had devised when he made this deck. Using a combination of Card Trooper, Rat Box, and the Psychic Engine, you could dump a lot of Earth monsters in your graveyard. Once you had 5, you could summon Grand Soil. What was cool about Grand Soil is none of its effects were once per turn, so if you had 5 monsters in your graveyard, you could theoretically summon 3 from your hand, and on top of that, the 3 in your hand would all be allowed to resolve their effects. But by nature of the game, you weren't always going to have multiple Grand Soils, but even if your Grand Soil went to the graveyard and you went over your limit to 6 monsters, it was fine. The Psychic monsters in your deck allowed you to banish your other Psychic monsters, making it possible to always have 5 monsters in your graveyard, meaning more Grand Soils. At 2800 attack, Grand Soil wasn't to be taken lightly. Being able to monster reborn from either player's graveyard made this a very good Synchro deck as well. You could bring back your own tuner monsters, or even bring back cards to be synchroed with the tuner. Even more spicy in this deck was the inclusion of Miracle Synchro Fusion, a card that allowed you to fusion summon from your graveyard using Synchro monsters as the material. In all, this is a classic Jeff Jones deck. It hasn't been seen before or since. South of the border at Guatemala, we'd see Angel Flores take first place with Hero Beat. Hero Beat was a very strong deck during this period, hence the limiting of a Hero Lives and E-Emergency Call. And yet, those hits didn't actually do anything. This deck is running 1 Emergency Call and no copies of a Hero Lives. What's further amusing about this deck is that it isn't even a complete hero deck, it's only actually running 4 hero monsters in the main deck. Instead of heroes, we are seeing cameos from the likes of Thunder King Ryo, Neospatian Grand Maul, Card D, Fossil Diner, and Crusader of Endymion, a card that does nothing. Like literally, you're not using the card's effect in this deck. You're just using it to act as fodder for Gemini Spark and Miracle Fusion. The September 2012 ranked up format is one that quite a few people have some fondness of, and there are some people who are playing it today. It wouldn't be a very long-lived format, however, as once again new card releases would bring major winds of change to the game. October 2012 would bring the release of Shonen Jump promo, Super Dreadnought Rail Cannon Gustav Max. This was a rank 10 Earth Machine monster that required 2 level 10 monsters. You're probably thinking, what deck is playing that? At the time, not many decks were playing it, but it was a card with a lot of potential, especially with its 3000 attack stat line and effect that read, once per turn, you can detach 1 material from this card, inflict 2000 points of damage to your opponent. Remember Dark Strike Fighter? The players at the time certainly hadn't forgotten, and we looked at this card with great interest. More importantly, however, was the release of the Realm of the Sea Emperor structure deck. This deck included many good water reprints, but most important was the introduction of Atlanteans as an archetype. Atlanteans had already existed through the normal monster Atlantean Pikeman, but now they were their own deck. The 3 main cards of the deck would be Atlantean Dragoons, Atlantean Marksmen, and Atlantean Heavy Infantry. Atlanteans were very unique monsters for the time, because you see their effects activated if they were used as cost for other water monster effects. But let's not get ahead of ourselves here, they also had secondary effects for when they were on the field. Atlantean Heavy Infantry gave you an extra normal summon of a Sea Serpent monster, meaning that theoretically you could summon Deep Sea Diva, special summon Heavy Infantry from deck, normal summon a second Deep Sea Diva, and then summon another Sea Serpent monster from your deck. Meaning that if you're fortunate enough to open 2 Deep Sea Divas, you go +2. Atlantean Marksman's own Theo effect was that when it inflicted battle damage to your opponent, you could special summon 1 Atlantean monster from your deck. Finally, Atlantean Dragoons allowed all level 3 or lower Sea Serpent type monsters you control to attack your opponent directly. But these are all decent field effects, but they're not meta contender effects. That's when we get to their secondary effects. If you use Atlantean Heavy Infantry as card cost for a water monster's effect, such as tributing or discarding, it is able to destroy 1 face-up card your opponent controls. If Marksman is sent as cost, it can destroy a set card your opponent controls. But best of all is Atlantean Dragoons. If that is sent for cost, you can search your deck for any Sea Serpent monster, except itself, and add it to your hand. None of these effects were once per turn. You were able to get the Dragoon's search effect as many times as you sent Dragoons that turn. And on top of that, these effects could not miss timing, they were mandatory. Now I'm giving these cards a lot of setup, but as of October there were no decks that could really take advantage of their effects. Well, that's when we come to November. Releasing on November 9th was Abyss Rising, the best water supporting main deck set ever made. Starting with the Exceeds, this deck had support from Adolches, and also the introduction of Gagaga Cowboy, one of the most famous monsters in the game. Cowboy had 2 effects, but we're only going to focus on 1. When this card is in defense position, you can detach 1 material from this card, inflict 800 life points to your opponent. This card being a rank 4 meant it was widely played, and led to the creation of one of this game's most famous questions. Cowboy for game? In the Exceed department we got 2 standout water monsters, Bahamut Shark and Abystrella. Shark required 2 level 4 water monsters and had the effects where, once per turn, you can detach 1 Exceed material from this card, special summon 1 rank 3 or lower water Exceed monster from your extra deck. This card cannot attack until the end of this turn. Now, much has been said about the strength of summoning monsters straight from the deck, but it's not often you get a monster who just allows you to straight up summon anything from the extra deck, bypassing their regular summoning condition. At the time, Bahamut Shark was merely good, but a few years later it had become one of the best Exceed monsters in the game. Abystrella on the other hand, this was top tier from the get-go. This card had a quick effect, an effect that could activate on either player's turn, where you could detach 1 material from this card, your opponent cannot activate the effects of cards in the graveyard that turn. As Lockdown and Floodgate effects go in Yu-Gi-Oh!, this is one of the best, and the card is still widely played today, much to the joy and disdain of many. Elsewhere we had the second wave of support for Madolches and Spellbugs, but let's talk about the main event here. First, we have the water monster, Morning Glacier the Elemental Lord. Remember Grand Soil? Well, this is the water version. This card can only be special summoned from the hand where you have exactly 5 water monsters in your graveyard. If this card is special summoned by its effect successfully, you can make your opponent discard 2 cards from their hand. Grand Soil was good, but this is a lot more high impact. However, unlike Grand Soil, Konami had the foresight to make this effect a hard once per turn. If you could activate Morning Glacier 3 times in a single turn, you could make your opponent discard their entire hand. Thankfully, we were spared that fate, and the card was properly balanced on release. And then we have the new deck that took the entire dueling world by storm, Mermails. Where do I start with Mermails? The deck covers the Aqua, Fish and Sea Serpent types. They have insane synergy with just about any water card, and most importantly, they were pretty much designed to work with the Atlanteans. So let's go through some of them, shall we? Mermail Abyss Lind. If this card on the field is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, you can special summon 1 Mermail monster from your deck, except Mermail Abyss Lind. You can only use this effect of Mermail Abyss Lind once per turn. So if Abyss Lind is destroyed, be that by battle or card effect, you can summon any Mermail monster from your deck regardless of their level. Mermail Abyssgund. If this card is discarded to the graveyard, you can target 1 Mermail monster in your graveyard, except Mermail Abyssgund, special summon that target. You can only use this effect once per turn. Plenty of ways to discard cards in this game. You're going to be using this Monster Reborn effect on your cards often. Mermail Abyss Spike. When this card is normal or special summoned, you can discard 1 water monster to your graveyard, add 1 level 3 water monster from your deck to your hand. You can only use this effect once per turn. So it's a searcher that can trigger your Abyssgund and even search your Abyss Lind. Pretty nice. Finally, we have the big bad boss of the deck, Mermail Abyss Megalo. This level 7 water sea serpent has 2400 attack and 1900 defense. You can discard 2 other water monsters to the graveyard, special summon this card from your hand. When you do, you can add 1 Abyss spell/trap from your deck to your hand. You can tribute 1 other face-up attack position water monster. This card can make a second attack during each battle phase this turn. Abyss Megalo works a bit differently to cards like Swap Frog. Swap Frog is a non-chainable special summon that discards water monsters as cost. However, it is not an effect activation, which means it cannot trigger the effects of Atlantean monsters. Mermail Abyss Megalo, however, is an effect activation. When you discard monsters for its summon, you are discarding for an activated effect. This allows Atlanteans to trigger in the graveyard. So, if you discard 2 copies of Atlantean Dragoons for Abyss Megalo's summon, you can then chain 1 Atlantean Dragoon Search, chain 2 Atlantean Dragoon Search, chain 3 Abyss Megalo Search and Abyss Spell Trap from your deck. This causes a practice known as chain blocking. Say your opponent is using trap cards like Debunk to try and stop you searching with Atlantean Dragoons, they would not be able to activate it because Abyss Megalo would be on chain link 3. Not only did this deck have near unstoppable searching, but could also break fields. Attacking twice is one way to do it, but if you tribute an Atlantean for that second attack, the Atlantean can then destroy cards on your opponent's field. Overall, Mermails were a OTKing powerhouse, and they had tools for controlling the game as well, as we see in their Exceed boss monster, Mermail Abyss Gaios. This rank 7 water aqua monster has 2800 attack and the summoning requirement of 2 level 7 water monsters. While this face-up card has Exceed material, level 5 or higher monsters cannot attack. Once per turn, during either player's turn, you can detach 1 Exceed material from this card to negate the effects of all face-up monsters your opponent controls. Boy howdy, a quick effect, all negate. So yeah, Abyss Rising is a super impactful set to the game, one of the biggest leaps in power level it's seen in a while. And yet despite this huge leap in power, it didn't really affect the game that negatively. In fact, Mermail is a deck that's looked back on very fondly by players. So that brings us to the end of 2012. There were some tournaments here and there, but this meta wasn't really going to develop until the start of the following year. The biggest thing the game had going for it in December was the release of number 50, Black Ship of Corn, a promo from the Yu-Gi-Oh! Sexal manga. It was another card on the list of generic rank 4s that gave you +1 removal. So that's the end of 2012. Join us in 2013 as we examine one of the craziest, most high-power archetypes ever created. See ya.